So good morning, folks. And I'll join my colleagues in saying that it's great to be in Denmark, which is a country where there was a collective decision to become world leading in wind power and to bring down emissions. And I think you've heard from John what the results of that have been. So those of you who are Danish citizens, I think you can feel pretty good compared to a lot of other countries in the world that have not been able to make those kinds of commitments and not been able to deliver on them either. I'm not going to show you a PowerPoint. I'm going to talk to you about the politics. Because the science is one thing, but the science has been more or less clear for 20 years. And so what is happening now with this report and with the synthesis report is that scientists are getting a much greater level of certainty about things that we have more or less understood for the last 2 decades. So what about the politics? What does this report mean in this bigger sequence of things that's going to happen between now and the end of 2015? Well, it's no coincidence that the report is coming out just before some very important negotiations that will take place in Peru in just about a month. So everybody is focusing on Paris at the end of 2015, but anyone who is around for the negotiations in Copenhagen can tell you if you wait until November of next year to get everything sorted for global negotiations, you will have a failure. So actually what is happening now in Peru in December is essential. And countries are supposed to be walking out of there with a draft negotiating text. Will they do it? It's not looking very good right now. There were just some negotiations in Germany where again, parties, negotiators were supposed to make progress, and they didn't do very well. So we're really looking forward now to Peru to see what happens. Now, after Peru, there's another really important milestone, and that is actually, that's actually the inside of the sandwich, if you like. It's the content. Because countries are going to have to come forward and say, this is how much I'm going to cut. And those commitments are going to start coming from March of 2015, and they will come, depending on whether you're a developed or developing country, between March and June of next year. And what is in those commitments, even if they're just the opening offer of governments, is going to tell us whether we can stay on track to stay under 2 degrees or not. So this whole period is really important. When we look towards the negotiations in Paris, WWF is going to be looking for a few things. So first of all, the negotiations are about a global agreement that is going to come into effect after 2020. But if you look at what the scientists here at the IPCC are telling us, if we wait until 2020 to start cutting emissions globally, we're sunk, right? We have to start now. And many more countries need to do what Denmark is doing. So there is actually a strand of work under the global negotiations, which is about the things that countries are going to do now. Also, while today's politicians are still in office and still accountable for the decisions that they're making about our future. The second thing we will be looking for is this global agreement, which is going to take us from 2020 onwards. And of course, that is really important because that agreement is going to set the framework for this decarbonization pathway that you've heard about from Stefan, but it's also going to set some of the other things that we need for decarbonization. So it's going to set some of the systems for finance, some of the mechanisms for bringing aid to people or assisting people or even compensating people for the damages they are suffering because of climate change. What does this report then mean for the sequence of things that we're going to see? Well, first of all, I don't know how many of you were following the process for the EU 2030 targets, right? Critically important. What did the EU do? It produced a grossly inadequate package. I'm just going to say it, but I'm not the only person who is saying that. It is not just coming from civil society. Scientists, lead scientists from the IPCC, people working in their national academies of science came out and said ahead of time, you must be more ambitious. But it wasn't just scientists. European labor unions came out and said, you must be more ambitious. Jobs depend on being more ambitious. But it wasn't just them. progressive multinational businesses, corporates, standing side by side with the labor unions, believe it or not, like IKEA and Unilever and others, came out and said, you must be more ambitious. They were calling for ambition nearly as high as civil society. And of course, civil society, we all said, you must be more ambitious. Now, we didn't get the package that we want, but what we are getting with this report is we are getting a very good and clear measuring stick against which we can look at these commitments and say to countries, it is a fact, you must do more. There are other things we will also get from the synthesis report, and there are things that we all know intuitively, but of course it always helps when scientists say them. So one of them is also about equity. You know, we talked about the gap between what countries are committing to and what is actually needed to avoid really catastrophic climate change. Well, the second thing that is in this report, it is about justice and fairness. So the report actually makes it clear that the decisions that we're not making right now, these are decisions which can, if we do not turn them around, which can roll back all of the gains that we're making on poverty alleviation globally. So you heard Stefan's and Leah's presentations about food and water security. That is the future that we're facing in a world where most people are poor. And so for people who are extremely poor and vulnerable, a world of more climate change will make it impossible for them to meet their needs, impossible for them to have different lives. It will even threaten lives and livelihoods. So that is one thing that comes out very clearly from this report. But there's another aspect to justice, and I think everyone in this room, I mean, we all have, if we don't have children, we know people, we know youth and students. I have 2 children. It is about intergenerational justice. So if you ever speak to youth advocates on climate, you will hear so much anger about the actions that my generation has failed to take. And that is also something that comes out very clearly from this report. Without action now, we will be leaving people who are in their 20s and 30s and facing many other kinds of crises with a burden of making very rapid, very difficult, very challenging shifts in a range of systems, from economies to energy to you name it. So I'm going to end on a positive note, because I think when we talk about climate change, it is so easy to look at the science and to just think, what can we do about this? Well, this report has actually a very positive message, and it's important coming from these scientists because this is a very conservative publication, right? It represents the consensus of all of the scientists globally. What they're telling us is that changing this, having the kind of deep decarbonization, getting out of fossil fuels pathway that Dr. Singer described for us, that this is actually not going to be that expensive. It's not going to cripple global economies. It is actually only going to cost a fraction of a % of growth in global consumption alone. So in other words, we're not going to have to shut off the lights in developed countries in order to fight climate change. Indeed, in Denmark, you see a good example of the fact that you don't have to do that. And that is also confirmed by this report. And that is not even considering all of the other things that come with acting on climate change, like jobs, like competitive businesses, like cleaner air, like better human health, like more access to energy for the poor. All of those things come with acting. It is not just a big, difficult burden in the way that some people would have you believe. The last hopeful message is that it is actually not too late. So this is one thing that is going to come out from the report as well. Now, it doesn't mean that we can sit here for another 20 years watching our leaders negotiate and produce nothing. But what it does mean is that if they act rapidly between now and 2015 and also after 2015, we too can face a future that is safe from the very worst impacts of climate change. Thank you.